Hidden beyond the misty redwood coast of Northern California lies a fortress few outsiders have ever seen. Behind its electrified fences and gun towers, men spend years, sometimes decades, locked alone in concrete boxes the size of a parking space. This is Pelican Bay State Prison. Today, we open the door to America's most notorious supermax and reveal, in their own words and official records, what life is really like inside. In the late 1980s, California's prison system was bursting at the seams. Violence in older institutions like San Quentin and Folsom had escalated, with assaults on staff and gang wars between rival factions. State officials decided to build an entirely new kind of prison, one modeled on the supermax concept then emerging in Marion, Illinois. Pelican Bay State Prison opened in December 1989 on 275 acres of isolated land near Crescent City, just 13 miles from the Oregon border. It was designed to hold 2,280 high-risk inmates, including those classified as the worst of the worst. Unlike older prisons, Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, or SHU, was constructed to minimize all inmate movement and contact. According to California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR planning documents, its architects emphasized control through isolation. This meant double rows of electrified fencing, gun towers on every corner, and a layout of X-shaped housing blocks radiating from a central control hub. Even when it opened, prison officials and civil rights lawyers predicted it would become the epicenter of debates over solitary confinement. The heart of Pelican Bay's notoriety is its SHU, a complex of windowless concrete pods known by inmates simply as the Hole. Each cell measures about 8 feet by 10 feet. Inside, a concrete bed with a thin foam mattress, a stainless steel toilet and sink combination, a small shelf, and nothing else. Fluorescent. Its lights glow overhead 24 hours a day. There are no bars, just solid gray doors with a narrow perforated slot. Meals are slid through a tray port. Human contact is nearly non-existent. Official CDCR regulations allow yard time for SHU prisoners, but the yard is not an open field. It's a walled concrete pen roughly the size of a racquetball court with a 20-foot mesh ceiling. Inmates call it the dog run. They're escorted there alone, in handcuffs, often after strip searches. According to a 2011 report by California's Office of the Inspector General, the average SHU prisoner spent 22.5 to 24 hours per day locked inside his cell. Pelican Bay's SHU isn't just for violent incidents. It's primarily for those labeled gang affiliates. Under CDCR's validation process, evidence such as tattoos, possession of artwork, or even names in a confiscated address book could be used to prove membership in groups like the Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, or Black Guerrilla Family. Once validated, inmates could be placed in indefinite solitary confinement, sometimes for decades, unless they debriefed, a euphemism for informing on others. This policy became one of the most controversial aspects of Pelican Bay. Civil liberties groups argued it punished prisoners for association rather than behavior. A 2012 Amnesty International report noted that more than 500 Pelican Bay prisoners had been in solitary for over 10 years. Some, like Todd Ashker, who later became the lead plaintiff in Ashker v. Governor of California, spent more than 2 decades in the SHU without a single disciplinary infraction. What does a day actually look like? Former inmates describe a monotony that blurs weeks into years. Breakfast trays arrive around 5:30 a.m. through the slot. Lukewarm oatmeal, a slice of bread, sometimes powdered eggs. Showers occur 3 times a week in a small stall secured by grates. There are no educational or vocational programs. Prisoners pass the time reading, doing push-ups, or sending kites, tiny notes slid under doors to neighboring cells. Medical care is delivered through metal cuffs and glass partitions. A 1995 federal lawsuit, Madrid v. Gomez, documented systemic failures in mental health treatment, noting that sensory deprivation and lack of sunlight led to high rates of depression, paranoia, and self-harm. The court found conditions for mentally ill inmates violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. By the summer of 2011, frustration inside the SHU had reached a breaking point. Groups of prisoners who had been isolated for years began coordinating across racial and gang lines. On July 1, 2011, more than 6,600 inmates at Pelican Bay and other California prisons refused meals to protest indefinite solitary confinement, lack of adequate food, and the debrief or die gang validation policy. It was the largest coordinated hunger strike in state prison history at the time. California's Department of Corrections initially dismissed the protest, but as it spread to 13 other facilities and hundreds of men began losing dangerous amounts of weight, lawmakers took notice. The Los Angeles Times and Sacramento Bee ran front-page stories. Civil rights groups called the strike a human rights emergency. 2 years later, the movement reignited on an even larger scale. In July 2013, more than 29,000 prisoners across California, led by Pelican Bay's SHU, joined a new hunger strike. Their 5 core demands included an end to long-term solitary confinement, changes to the gang validation system, adequate and nutritious food, expanded educational and rehabilitative programming, greater opportunities for family contact. This strike lasted nearly 2 months. Dozens of inmates were hospitalized. At least one, Billy Guero cell, died after his repeated medical requests were reportedly ignored. His death later cited by the American Civil Liberties Union and state legislators as evidence of systemic neglect. Assemblymember Tom Amiano held hearings in Sacramento, calling Pelican Bay a moral stain on California's justice system. The hunger strike set the stage for a landmark class-action lawsuit filed in 2012 by long-term SHU prisoners, including Todd Ashker, against the state. The case argued that decades in isolation violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment and the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. In 2015, the state agreed to a sweeping settlement. California would end indefinite solitary confinement based solely on gang validation and institute a new step-down program to allow gradual return to general population. Hundreds of Pelican Bay prisoners were transferred out of the SHU in the following months. Legal scholars called the settlement the most significant solitary confinement reform in U.S. history. For men who had spent 10, 15, or even 25 years in the SHU, the transition back to general population, or to other prisons, was jarring. Former Pelican Bay prisoner Gabriel Reyes told KPCC Radio he hadn't seen the night sky or hugged a family member in over a decade. Suddenly, he was in a crowded yard with dozens of other inmates. Some thrived, others struggled with severe anxiety, hypersensitivity to noise, or difficulty trusting anyone. CDCR established transitional yards and therapy groups, but mental health advocates said the support was uneven. A 2017 state audit found many former SHU prisoners were placed in restrictive custody again under new labels, raising concerns of solitary by another name. While prisoners fought for change from within, families on the outside carried much of the advocacy load. Mothers, wives, and children formed the California Families to Abolish Solitary Confinement Coalition, traveling hours from Los Angeles or the Bay Area to the remote Crescent City facility for brief visits through thick glass. They organized rallies at the state capitol, delivered petitions to the governor's office, and held vigils for prisoners who died inside. The 2013 strike's 5 core demands were printed on placards and banners at every protest. These family members, many of them working-class women of color, became the public face of a movement that reframed Pelican Bay not just as a security issue, but as a human rights crisis. For years, Pelican Bay existed in near invisibility. Journalists rarely gained access, and CDCR tightly controlled information, but the hunger strikes and lawsuits cracked that wall. Major outlets, the New York Times, 60 Minutes, PBS NewsHour, began airing segments on solitary confinement at Pelican Bay. Photos of the SHU's stark cells and windowless yards circulated online, shocking viewers who had assumed U.S. prisons allowed outdoor exercise. In 2014, UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez cited Pelican Bay in a report urging the U.S. to limit solitary to 15 days or less, aligning with the Mandela rules. California suddenly found itself at the center of an international debate. Even some corrections officials acknowledged the system had to change. After the 2013 hunger strike, California's legislature held multiple hearings on conditions inside Pelican Bay. Former prisoners, family members, and medical experts testified about the psychological harm of long-term isolation. At one hearing in the state capitol, Assemblymember Amiano called the SHU a dungeon that has no place in a civilized society. CDCR officials defend the program as necessary for safety, but quietly began rewriting policies to comply with the Ashker settlement. By 2016, the number of inmates in Pelican Bay's SHU had fallen from more than 1,100 to fewer than 300. The hearings also spurred bills requiring more transparency in use of force incidents and disciplinary reviews. One of the settlement's unintended consequences was the rapid transfer or release of men who had been isolated for decades. Some went straight from a SHU cell to the free world, with no reentry services. Psychiatrist Dr. Terry Coopers warned that sensory deprivation causes lasting damage, hypersensitivity to sound, distrust, and a heightened startle response. Interviews with former Pelican Bay prisoners published by the Marshall Project in 2017 showed mixed outcomes. A few reconnected with family and jobs, while others cycled back into the criminal justice system, unable to navigate unstructured environments. Advocates argued for mandatory pre-release programs tailored to long-term isolation survivors. Federal courts had already found in Madrid v. Gomez, 1995, that Pelican Bay's SHU violated the rights of mentally ill inmates. Yet decades later, mental health treatment remained scarce. A 2014 report by the Center for Constitutional Rights described chronic underdiagnosis of PTSD, depression, and psychosis among isolated prisoners. Some reforms have been implemented: suicide-resistant cells, telepsychiatry sessions, crisis intervention training for staff. But many former SHU prisoners still struggle with nightmares and paranoia. The Pelican Bay experience became a case study in how extreme isolation can reshape human behavior and brain chemistry. After the settlement, CDCR introduced new designations such as Restricted Custody General Population, RCGP, and Administrative Segregation to manage high-risk prisoners. Officially, these units offered more out-of-cell time, small group programming, and step-down opportunities. Critics, including the Prison Law Office, argued that conditions in some RCGP units resembled solitary by another name: tiny yards, heavy restraints, and minimal contact. This tension sparked fresh litigation and a 2019 legislative push to codify limits on solitary confinement. The debate over Pelican Bay shifted from whether to isolate to how and for how long. In 2015, the United Nations adopted the Mandela Rules, which define solitary confinement beyond 15 consecutive days as prolonged and potentially torture. Human rights groups held up Pelican Bay as Exhibit A for why the U.S. needed to change. By 2020, California had reduced its SHU population dramatically, but hundreds of prisoners statewide still spent months in segregation cells. The Pelican Bay story, its rise as a model of control and its partial dismantling, helped reshape national policy. Other states, from Colorado to New York, cited the Ashker settlement when passing their own reforms. Yet survivors and advocates warn that without independent oversight, solitary confinement can re-emerge under new labels. For decades, Pelican Bay State Prison stood as the ultimate symbol of control through isolation. Rows of gray cells, silent yards, lives lived in concrete boxes. But hunger strikes, lawsuits, and family advocacy forced open its doors to public scrutiny. Policies changed, and thousands of men were moved out of indefinite solitary confinement. Still, the debate over how we punish and how we rehabilitate remains unresolved. As California continues to wrestle with these questions, Pelican Bay endures as both a warning and a lesson about the human cost of extreme incarceration.